So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Bradford Lecture Series. Happy you all came out. I'm trying to move so the light doesn't shine in my eyes, not being able to do it. Right. Happy you all came out. A little bit cooler today, but believe me, in December, you will be praying for the weather we have right now. Right. So my name is Nikki Sheets. I don't think any of you know me. There's no reason why you should. Yes, well, personally. My full-time job is at King University, which is a university in central New Jersey, where I'm the director of the Center for the Urban Environment of the John S. Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research. But I'm also a part-time lecturer here. I lecture in EJ, on EJ issues. I'm a member of the national grassroots EJ movement through my membership in the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and about half a dozen other EJ coalitions and organizations on both the state and national level. And so that's why I'm particularly happy to introduce our speaker today, Professor Nataki Osborne Jelks. She's an assistant professor in environmental and health sciences at Spelman University. I'm particularly happy to introduce her because she does EJ for environmental justice, right? In particular, more particularly, she investigates urban environmental health disparities. By that, we probably mean health disparities, or at least included in that. She also investigates the role that race and income play in determining health. And she develops, implements, and evaluates community-based initiatives that are intended to improve the quality of life in EJ communities. EJ communities, i.e. communities of color and low-income communities. She is also currently co-leading an initiative in Atlanta. Spelman's in Atlanta, remember. She's co-leading an initiative in Atlanta that involves both students and community residents mapping heat islands. She also co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance on EJ, which works to make a cleaner, greener, healthier West Atlanta. Professor Jelks, I know I was in a coalition where your coalition was represented. As if that's not enough, she's also the co-chair of NEJAC. NEJAC is a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It advises EPA on environmental justice issues, but more importantly, NEJAC has traditionally been the place where EJ organizations from all across the country come to publicize the EJ issues they're working on and to get help for those issues. So we're very lucky to have Professor Jelks here today. Thank you for taking the time, Professor Jelks, to talk to us. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Professor Jelks will talk about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes left over for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheets. I really appreciate that kind introduction. Thanks to those who invited me to be with you today, and thanks to you who are in the audience today watching. I regret that I was not able to make it there in person, but maybe there will be some opportunity that I can get back. But again, I appreciate you having me today and listening to me remotely from chilly Atlanta on today. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and go ahead and get started. Somehow. Okay. All right. So the title of my talk today is Taking Science to the Streets, Participatory Research Approaches to Improve Environment, Health, and Quality of Life in Urban Areas. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do, the community engaged work that I do, and really based on my introduction, you probably heard a couple of different things going on there. So I am a faculty member at Spelman College, but I also help to co-found a community-based environmental justice organization. So I really bring that community orientation to all of the work that I do, because I spent quite a bit of time just as a community organizer and a community leader before I decided to go back to graduate school to get some advanced degrees and to now find myself also in academia while working in this community space. So I want to add a few things to my personal introduction by way of really, how I got involved in this work in the first place, talk a little bit about Atlanta as a site of study for environmental health disparities research, give you a brief orientation to community engaged research, and then talk about 3 examples. 2 of those examples deal with a watershed that I'm very engaged in, and I'll talk about that. And the last example is the Urban Heat ATL project that Dr. Sheets just mentioned. So I am a daughter of the South, born in Mississippi, but I grew up for a number of years in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, spent some time in Kentucky, which is more so the Southeast, and have, now spent the bulk of my life in Atlanta. I came to Atlanta for college and never left. And so now I've lived here longer than any other place that I've ever been. But this theme, the constant theme here, with respect to my upbringing is that I'm a daughter of the South. And some would call the South the dirty South. Some call the South the Black Belt region. Some call it the Bible Belt region. And there are a number of different ways that we can characterize the South, but this idea of the dirty South comes from the reality that there are a number of environmental hazards and stressors found in the Deep South in particular. Communities of color and lower income communities are disproportionately impacted by these environmental hazards and stressors. What one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Bullard, says is that the South has a legacy of unequal protection. Why would the environment be any different? This idea that when we think about issues around voting rights, in the state of Georgia, we're dealing right now with issues around voter suppression, around reactive laws and policies that have been put in place since there was a lot of work on the ground to change our representation in Congress from the state of Georgia. And so Dr. Bullard, who has written, I think, 14 to 18 or so books around environmental justice issues. He's published hundreds and hundreds of articles about environmental justice issues. He talks about this legacy of unequal protection that extends beyond what we typically think about with the South to issues of the environment. And again, he's saying, why would the environment be any different? And from my perspective, growing up in the South, I don't think it has been any different. So here I want to introduce you to Cancer Alley. This is where I spent a number of years growing up. I lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and this corridor known as Cancer Alley is between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, an 85-mile stretch of land where there are over 134 or so chemical companies, petrochemical companies, and other pollution-generating facilities. And this shot just gives you some sense of the massiveness of what's happening in this Cancer Alley corridor. You see a lot of industries here. What's not as easy to point out here are the communities that are up and down this stretch, up and down the Mississippi River corridor, where people are in close proximity to polluting industries, to these chemical plants, to these petrochemical plants, and to these other pollution generating facilities in the Cancer Alley corridor. And growing up here, I recognized at a point that there were some issues there that might be impacting our health. I definitely observed and understood that the pollution index was always high. We had the very real experience of the water smelling bad and tasting bad. We smelled the churn of these industries, what some people call the smell of progress. But we saw the billowing smoke. We smelled the things that were not natural to smell in our local environment. And for me, this was sort of the beginning of a wake-up call that the things in our environment could impact our health, but definitely they impacted our quality of life as well as our well-being. What really struck me after living in this area, and this is the facility that is within a 1 mile radius of the house that I grew up in, and where I still have family living today, was this facility. And so, with this facility being within a mile of where we lived, it became very real to us that we could be impacted by what was happening at this plant. And I will just point out that when we talk about Cancer Alley, we talk primarily about low-income communities and communities of color who are living in closest proximity to these polluting industries. But I will also just share with you that I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood. And in that middle-class neighborhood, we also were not immune from exposure and being in close proximity to these polluting industries. So I wanted to give that additional introduction to who I am to really introduce this idea that place matters. We know, science tells us from a lot of research that has been conducted that place and health are inextricably linked. That where you live impacts how you live, and it can also impact your quality of life, health, and well-being. We know that improving health cannot be addressed disease by disease, but it must be informed by a very comprehensive understanding of the wide range of factors that shape our health status. We also know that people thrive when they live in communities in which they can earn, living wages. We know that people thrive when children can get quality education, when we have easy and safe access to parks, to green spaces, to grocery stores that sell fresh, affordable foods. And we also know that families cannot thrive in unhealthy environments. So when we think about how communities are designed in this country in particular, we know that all communities were not created equal. There are some communities that we characterize as these communities of opportunity that have those amenities within the communities that help folks in those communities to be healthy, from parks to sidewalks, to grocery stores that have, again, fresh and affordable foods, fruits and vegetables, and not just calorie and sugar dense products that are very highly processed. We talk about those communities of opportunity as places where there are thriving financial institutions, where we have good performing schools, where we have access to public transportation. And the list could, be a lot longer. We could, talk about a number of other things that help us to create these communities of opportunity. But then there are other communities. Again, all communities aren't created equal. Some communities are heavily populated with fast food restaurants, with liquor stores, unsafe parks, few sidewalks, places where you can't, cross transportation corridors to get to locations where people need to be for work or to, get their groceries or other things that are important. These are communities that oftentimes have increased, exposure to pollution and to toxic waste sites, and sometimes, again, limited public transportation. Again, there are a number of other things that we could talk about in terms of communities that we don't characterize by this title, communities of opportunity, but in communities of color and low-income communities, we oftentimes find these things. So now I want to bring you just a little bit closer to where I am in the city of Atlanta. And these are the ancestral lands of the Muskogee Creek Native Americans. But in 2009, which is now several years ago now, Atlanta was named America's Most Toxic City by Forbes magazine. And it was given this moniker based on a number of factors, things like the number of EPA responses in the principal city, the number of facilities that were releasing toxic chemicals, the pounds of toxic chemicals released, as well as our air quality ranking. That air quality ranking has gotten much better over the past several years, but at the time that data was being analyzed to designate this America's Most Toxic City, Atlanta was at the top of the list. So then that was 2009. 2012, there was a study called Patterns of Pollution, which looked at racial and social demographic issues in Atlanta, but it also looked at the number of environmental hazards and stressors were in a 14-county metropolitan Atlanta area. And so here you see this outline of this 14-county area. If you can see my cursor kind of circling here, this is Fulton County, which is the most populous county in the state of Georgia. It is a county that in which most of the city of Atlanta is located, but the city spans between Fulton and DeKalb counties, but the majority of the city is located in Fulton County. And then here, you may not be able to see it very well, but this is a box that has number 4. And all of these boxes, the red boxes that are numbered, are the environmental justice hotspots. So 52 environmental justice hotspots were found in this 14-county metropolitan Atlanta area. The hotspots are places where you have overlapping cumulative environmental hazards. And so in this case, by this particular study, that meant you had multiple pollution sources, whether we were talking about toxic waste facilities, sites that report to the toxic release inventory, meaning that they are releasing chemicals to the air, water, or soil, sites that release pollutants to the air, etc. So where you see these red boxes, numbered boxes, you had multiple environmental hazards, and there was a cumulative score developed to look at, which areas had the most environmental hazards, and so they came out with a larger cumulative environmental hazard score, and it was then overlapped with a score for social vulnerability. So the authors of this study looked at things like race and ethnicity. They looked at income level, education level. They looked at the number of people in the population who were older than the age of 60, younger than the age of 5. And these are, largely what we think to be, vulnerable, populations in the context of health. And they also looked at things like whether or not these communities had resources to be able to fight or to contend with these environmental hazards in their community borders. And so where you had overlapping high levels of social vulnerability with overlapping high levels of environmental hazards is where you see these red boxes. And so they're numbered from 1 to 52. Number 1 had the highest overlapping vulnerability, and number 4 is essentially in my community and in the broader community that my institution is located in as well. So this is the number 4 hotspot out of 52. I will just note that that the blue boxes that are not numbered are called environmental justice cold spots. So these are places where there was a high level of or high score developed or generated for the environmental hazards in those areas, but you did not have the same overlapping high levels of social vulnerability. So communities that had some significant environmental hazards to contend with, but in many cases they had whether a higher income level or other factors that deem these communities more able to contend with those hazards. And in some cases, you had some communities that had enough resources to hire attorneys to fight some of those facilities and to get enforcement action taken against those facilities who were thought to be some of the bigger culprits of pollution in those communities. So big difference between those environmental justice hotspots and those cold spots. Now I want to zero in just a bit on Fulton County itself. And so the number 4 in that last map, where I pointed out that environmental justice hotspot, in my community, is located here. And so when you zero in on Fulton County, you do see that In this county, there are environmental hazards that are distributed in different places, in different parts of the county. So some in the northern part of the county, some in the southern part of the county, and then a number of them are concentrated, hyper located and hyper concentrated in this area, which makes up a large part of the city of Atlanta. So I want to point out this correlation between what you just saw on the last map and what you're seeing here in terms of the hazardous waste sites, solid waste facilities, toxic release inventory sites, wastewater treatment plants, or combined sewer overflow facilities, etc. All hyper concentrated in this area. And if I were there with you in person, I might ask a few questions of you in the room in terms of your observations here, and maybe some predictions that you would make or assumptions that you might make about what you see here in terms of the population demographics. But since I'm not in person, what I'll just share with you, when we think about those folks who make up the population, of this county, the northern part of the county is more white and more affluent. The southern part of the county, I will say, has a decent mix, but definitely when we talk about sort of this central region of the county, if you will, these are the communities that are predominantly African-American or Black communities. And these are communities that have a lower median income than other parts of the county. So in Atlanta, as well as a number of other places across the country, life expectancy differs based on where you live. And so if we can think again about this same community that I've just been talking about, that was characterized as that number 4 hotspot that you saw in the last map of Fulton County, of this area, where you had a clustering of different types of environmental hazards. Within that area is a community called the Bankhead community. And so in data that was published a couple of 3 years ago by the National Center for Health Statistics and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, this area, this Bankhead community, referenced in both of the previous maps that you just saw, the life expectancy was found to be about 63.6 years of age. So this is before the standard retirement age of 65. But not only that, this area had folks, on average die at an age of 63.6, but life expectancy for the Vinings area, which is in a neighboring county, it's in Cobb County. So this is Fulton County. Cobb is right here. Can't see it really well here on this map, but this is where I'm circling is largely Fulton County. This is Cobb County, and literally right over the county line, just a few miles away from the Bankhead neighborhood. This neighborhood is the Vinings neighborhood, and you have an 87.6 year life expectancy. So we're talking about a difference of 24 years. 24 years. And some of my research is focused on trying to better understand what is driving that huge difference. Definitely I have some educated guesses that I can make, about the number of environmental hazards that impact the Bankhead community. When we talk about Atlanta, not only did it get this name as America's most toxic city in 2009, it has consistently gotten the title, of the poster child for income inequality in the United States. So we've got the haves and the have-nots. We've got a number of affluent communities and populations, and then we've got some of the poorest of the poor in the metropolitan Atlanta area, but specifically within the city proper. So here, there are a number of things that we could, kind of point to, but we don't necessarily know what is most driving these differences in life expectancy. And 24 years for just a few miles difference is huge. And so that's something that increasingly folks are focused on trying to better understand. And that's definitely a goal of mine to contribute to this body of work. now I'd like to give you sort of an orientation to community engaged research, and we could, have an entire lecture focused on community engaged research. So what I will say is really just the tip of the iceberg, but I think there's some important things that can come out of our conversation today. And so the first thing that I want to say is that there really is a big difference between research that is performed on populations and communities, in those populations and communities, and with populations and communities. I like to focus my work with populations and communities as much as possible. And I have because of my, my hat, as a community leader myself, I try to bring these worlds together as much as possible. I have, done a lot of work and research in my own community, trying to better understand the scientific phenomenon, but also trying to make some specific changes happen within my community. I do a lot of that work under the umbrella of what we call community-based participatory research, but I will say that moving beyond community-based participatory research, there is something called community-owned and managed research that we're ultimately striving for. How can communities build the capacity and have the resources that they need to conduct their own research, and to call in the academics and other researchers who can help them as needed. But how can they really direct the train and keep things going totally on their own terms, to study the issues of concern, but not just to study them, but to use the results of that research to press for policy change. So I'd like to share with you a comparison of traditional academic research versus community research. And I'll just kind of start, with this idea of, what's the goal of the research? In traditional research, we're about, advancing scientific inquiry. We want to advance generalizable knowledge. And these things are, this is the bedrock, of scientific research. And we know that there are a number of innovations that come from that research. But when we put research in the context of a community, most of the time, the goal is the betterment of the community, change in policy systems, or environmental change within that community, to make conditions better, to help people be healthier, to eliminate disparities, to eliminate and to dismantle inequities and policies that may be racist or may have been racist in their intent, but definitely show up as racist in the outcomes. So there's a difference between research in a very traditional sense, and I definitely will say that there are a number of researchers who are starting to bring these worlds together, trying to advance that generalizable knowledge, but at the same time realize some changes in real time, if you will, in communities. When we think about the source of the research question, traditional research is based on a lot of theoretical work. It might be based on preliminary work, pilot studies that have been conducted, but all tying back to, some sort of theory. Community research really begins with community identified problems. And on some levels, maybe, when we look at some of the community identified problems, not every problem needs to have a research basis to get to a solution. But when research can be of assistance, to communities, then we want to still start with those community identified problems and figure out how the research can be used to advance solutions to those particular problems. In terms of who designs the research, in traditional, we're talking about, trained researchers, in many cases academics, but not exclusively. But, when we think a lot of times about, much of the peer-reviewed research that we read, in academic journals, there are trained researchers, trained academics who are designing this research. But in community research, and, the levels of engagement might vary based on the type of research approach. But when I think about community-based participatory research, when communities are involved in a meaningful way in every aspect of the community, of the research process, then you've got the trained researchers and community experts developing or designing that research together. The role of the research is oftentimes as the outside expert, as the objective, outsider. In community research, we're talking about both the community and those researchers being co-collaborators and co-learners. And I will submit to you that while research is supposed to be objective, people, even those who are trying to be the most objective, in their research, they bring their own positionality to that research, and their perspectives color and shape the questions that are asked as well as the questions that are not asked. So this idea of the outside expert, I push back on just a little bit because I believe that we all bring our past experience, we bring our lived experiences to the research. And I think that if we can acknowledge that, then we can, have a better understanding of how we develop our questions, what questions warrant asking that aren't necessarily being explored, and how we can collaborate in more meaningful ways with communities. The role of the community in traditional research is more of that of the subject of the study in many cases. But again, we're talking now in community research, the community as a collaborator, as a co-learner, not just the subject of the research, not just the folks who are under the microscope or magnifying glass, so to speak. But in many cases, even in community engaged research, and some of the research that I will share with you over the next 10 minutes is research in which community members are helping to collect that data, as well as they're helping to analyze it and to develop policy recommendations and solutions from it. I'll quicken up here and just say, in terms of the value of that research, in academia, peer-reviewed publications, are the currency of the day. In communities, the value of the research is seen by what change that research is able to advance. Communities want to own their data, in community engaged processes, and in terms of how that data and how the results are disseminated, from a community perspective, we're talking about any and all forms. So it can be, conferences and academic journals, but it could also be through media, through infographics, through town hall meetings in communities. Any and every way that you can think about it, we try to disseminate information that shows up as a result of this community engaged research. And so now let me just talk briefly. I mentioned community-based participatory research, or CBPR. You'll hear about that a lot in a number of circles. This is a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. So just as the last slide that I shared with you, CBPR begins with a research topic of importance to the community with this aim of combining knowledge and action for social change to improve community health and to eliminate health disparities. So we're talking again about things that might take time to change, but communities are looking for some results, some changes that span from things that can be done immediately to things that might have a longer time horizon. But the idea is that we want to break down some of these systemic barriers to health equity in communities who have been made to be most vulnerable to a number of environmental hazards and stressors, and because of a number of the policies that have shaped how our communities have been designed. I also want to introduce a term, community science, which is one definition of community science that is a collaboratively led scientific investigation, exploration, and engagement in the entirety of the scientific process. And so I try to do work that is very community science focused, but I'm also very fond of this framework called street science, which is a framework that joins local insights with professional scientific techniques with concurrent goals to improve scientific inquiry, but also to improve environmental health policy and decision-making. I really am drawn to this approach because A lot of my work is focused on, in some cases, training community members to collect water samples or to collect air samples or to take temperature measurements. But I like to bring those scientific techniques together with the lived experience, with the local community knowledge that community residents bring to the table, which is another way of knowing and a way of understanding the phenomenon that unfolds in our communities. And oftentimes those community perspectives are left out of our science. And when that happens, I really submit that our science is mediocre at best, and that we're potentially missing on ways that that community knowledge can fill in important gaps, not only to help us to diagnose and understand fully what the problems are, but also in terms of developing what the solutions might be. So I want to introduce to you in just the few minutes I have left, a study area for a lot of my work, the Proctor Creek watershed. And my institution is located here in the Atlanta University Centers, which is a consortium of 6 institutions. Spelman College is one of them. And so we are in the Proctor Creek watershed. And the watershed boundaries, basically this is the area, on the land surface that drains to a body of water called Proctor Creek. But it's been a very useful way for many of us in Atlanta to begin to look at some of the environmental hazards and stressors that impact our communities. Proctor Creek has historically been a place, been a source of pride for West Atlanta communities, a place where children have played, where people fished and swam, and a place where people were baptized. The creek is now very impaired. It's one of the most environmentally impaired creeks in metropolitan Atlanta, but it's on the upswing because of a lot of community engaged work that's happened. Some of that work has been water quality monitoring, in which community residents and students from my institution and others have engaged in exploration, around the environmental hazards that impact this body of water. This is important because Proctor Creek flows through front yards, backyards, school grounds, and public parks. And again, it's been a place where the community has had access to it, has been engaged with it. Folks have a relationship with it. And anecdotally, we know that people are still swimming in Proctor Creek. Anecdotally, we know that people are still, fishing and eating what they catch out of the creek. And kids are still playing in it, even though it may not be as safe to engage in many of these activities. And so we see the restoration of this creek, of this waterway, as an opportunity to improve the quality of life of the community as well. And so in addition to the water quality monitoring, there have been a number of projects in which community members have, conducted projects like what we call photo voice, taking photographs to represent the reality of the environmental challenges and stressors in the community, and then analyzing those photos, analyzing the collective themes found in those photos, and developing policy alternatives that they have, shared with local decision makers. And there has been some positive impact of that work in terms of new parks and green spaces and green infrastructure sites being developed to address things like flooding in the community, to address things like illegal dumping. These things have happened because community members have engaged in a research process and been a part of helping to analyze that data and translate that data into alternatives and policy recommendations that can change material conditions on the ground. Another part of that work has been the work of community members to do a lot of mapping, to collect spatial data around environmental hazards. So things like illegal dump sites, where there is dumping in the water, where there's dumping on land, locations of standing water, where there has been a lot of flooding, as well as the location of damaged or stormwater infrastructure that is not working. This has been really important because before the community began to develop its own data sets and to map these hazards in the community, when they talked to elected officials and shared concerns about places where there was flooding happening or places where there was illegal dumping, they were essentially told by a number of city officials that we're not aware of the flooding that's happening. We don't know about these dump sites. We think that you're really sending us on wild goose chases to find things that don't exist, or in some cases they were told, well, we know that there are some things happening, but we think that your perspectives are a bit exaggerated. And so when the community was able to compile its own evidence, both in terms of pictures and video, as well as spatial data from maps and GPS coordinates of where these different occurrences were happening, they were able to shed some light on what we call the hidden hazards in the community. And we've been able to get some action in terms of the city of Atlanta then doing its own investigations, finding out that the community was exactly right. And they've done some cleanup of some of these waste sites in terms of some of the water quality work. And I forgot to mention this when I was talking about water quality, a huge outcome of community engaged water quality monitoring has been that the city, while they haven't taken the community's data as the Bible, so to speak, they followed up on the community studies and found that there were a number of sewer lines that were leaking waste directly into Proctor Creek when some multifamily unit housing developments were flushing the toilets. There were some lines that had not been tied off that should have been. And so they were able to see that the data that the community generated was actually true. And not only that, gave them some insight on something that the city did not know. And they then invested hundreds of thousands into fixes based on the generation of that community data. I'm just about out of time here, but I want to just talk very briefly about one last project, and that is Urban Heat ATL. And this is a project in which students from Spelman College, Georgia Tech, as well as community members are joining together to map heat islands in metropolitan Atlanta. We know that extreme heat is the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, beyond hurricanes and tornadoes, superstorms, and other things that, that we're very familiar with. Heat is kind of that silent killer. And in urban spaces that are densely developed, we have urban heat islands, in which the profile of part of these urban areas is characterized by hotter temperatures. And there have been some studies done by researchers in a number of cities across the country that have shown that areas that have been historically redlined have some of the higher temperatures, definitely, areas that are densely developed, but also areas where you have large populations of communities of color and low-income communities is where we're seeing higher temperatures. And so in this project that we've been working on for the last year and a half or so, we are equipping community members and students with handheld temperature sensors. These are called pocket lab sensors. We also have a growing network of stationary sensors within our community here in Atlanta to try to better understand who's being most impacted and how those impacts and how folks' health is being impacted. We've collected about over 2 million data points since March of 2021. We're continuing that process to better understand. We haven't done a whole lot of data analysis. Some of the things that we assumed would be true are showing up to be true in terms of, communities, communities of color, low-income communities being most inundated with these higher temperatures. But we want to go beyond that to better not only understand the phenomenon, but to come up with geographically relevant, contextually relevant solutions so that our city can be more forward-thinking about how to address these issues in the future as we anticipate a number of as we anticipate, more climate hazards between now and the year 2050. Here are a couple of articles that reference, some of our work or the work that is happening in a number of cities to look at, kind of the imprint, the indelible imprint left of housing policies, developed in the 1930s or so on, that discriminated, quite honestly, against communities of color, against lower income communities, and how we're still seeing, a lot of impacts today in the form of extreme heat, in the form of more pollution, et cetera. And I'll just end by saying this work has already, and we're not finished with this project, already led some of the community-based organizations that we're working with to develop some partnerships with some national labs to look at passive low energy cooling solutions for our community, and to look at really a whole wide range of solutions that we can try to implement to help make our communities more climate resilient, but to also protect those who are most vulnerable to extreme heat. So I will stop there. I know that I'm about 3 minutes over. I'll leave my contact slide here for just a second, and then I'll come out of this to hopefully engage with you for the last few minutes in some questions.
Very much. I think you see why the work is so important. She's not only involved in community work, but she's actually improving the health of the community and directly to her community. Which makes sense. One thing I like to mention, my dad, I'm sorry, a PhD is actually in public health. She's dedicated her life to improving the health of communities. Where she comes from also. Questions? Professor Jelks. Yes, sir. Why don't you state your name and your what program you're in? Okay. And I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor Jelks. I'm Nick. I'm a sixth-year PhD student in the public policy program. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, I was wondering if you could say more about any challenges or strategies that you have learned about how to make sure the tools that you've developed, that the community can kind of maintain those over many years, like the mapping tools that you developed and the solutions that come from those. Can you say more about any strategies you have to make sure that that's kind of sustainable over, kind of once the research project maybe is over, but how do you keep that going as an ongoing effort?
So the question for purposes of, I'm saying for purposes of the recording, how is Dr. Jelks and their colleagues, the strategies they've developed to make sure that the tools they're developing and policy solutions live on beyond the project?
That's a great question. I think I got most of that. So in terms of the tools that we have been using and developing, one thing that we try to do is to make sure that the community has access to those tools. I definitely have been a part of some other initiatives where perhaps there was some engagement with a faculty member. That faculty member left the institution, developed some great tools, but once they left, if there were not things put in place to make sure that the community, had, continued access, then some of those efforts would sort of fall by the wayside. And, for the work that I do, it's very important to ensure that the community is at the table. And when I talked earlier about this, idea of community-owned and managed research, that really is the ultimate goal. How do communities ramp up, build enough capacity to be able to direct their own research? Again, pulling in academics and other researchers, as wanted and or needed, but how do we build that capacity within those community-based organizations? And so I'll give one example from the community-based organization that I helped to co-found. It was, co-founded by, regular community folks, but there were some folks in the community who did have some scientific expertise. And what we have done as an organization is to make sure that we have those community voices, at the table, but we look inside our community to see where there is scientific expertise, where there are those, who have, some ability to lift up, some of these things like research. And now that we have grown as an organization and been able to move beyond just an all volunteer base of folks, as we have hired folks. We have, hired some people who are trained scientists who have expertise, who are, helping to, build out the organizational infrastructure, to ensure that, we can, really be these equal partners in research initiatives and carry on the work even after academics or others, move on to other projects or move to other institutions. And while not every situation is going to have a community-based organization that has folks with, kind of trained scientific expertise, I think the key to it is just creating the tools in a way that they are as accessible as possible, to community folks. We're dealing with a lot of digital tools for some of the work that we're doing. So, how do we make sure that, community folks have their own logins and ways to access the GIS data, for instance? How do we make sure that, and from an academic side, can we sometimes place, students as interns with these community-based organizations to work with them, to better, adapt those tools, in a way that can be, used by communities. I don't want to go much longer because I could talk on and on about this particular, one topic, but I think, just having those community-based organizations, at the table in a very meaningful way and designing things, from the outset, in a way that those tools can be accessible to them and don't require, the engagement, of the academics, forever, so that things can continue is really the key.
Ms. Allen, I think Jim is in the furniture and then Jim.
Can I come up? Ryan Juskis, thank you so much, Dr. Jelks, for this work. It's really inspiring, and so glad that you're sharing it with us. Just a quick question that sort of comes out of my own work and is similar sort of questions in central Appalachia and coal mining areas and in North Birmingham around coal plants. What I've seen in those cases oftentimes is either efforts by industry groups or politicians or both, and some kind of connection, either trying to prevent certain kinds of science from happening, or if it does happen, to kind of discredit it in some way or kind of render it sort of politically neutral, if you will. And so one question is if you've seen anything like that in this work that you've done, either prevention or kind of discrediting, and if you have, sort of how you and your group has gone about kind of navigating or responding to that.
Thank you for that question. So I can't say that I have seen it in my own work in Atlanta in quite the same way with respect to industry. A lot of times, we have been, working, sometimes it feels like in a very adversarial way with government agencies. And there definitely has been a large amount of discrediting, community folks. Again, saying that people are exaggerating or don't, completely understand what's happening. And the way that we have addressed that, well, one, I would say that a lot of our community engaged work in which community members are doing some of this data collection has been like indirect response, to some of that. If, people weren't being heard, in terms of the community concerns that they brought, to community meetings or brought to elected officials or brought to municipal, staff, within our city government and other entities. And so when we started to, collect data and to analyze that data and to share that data out, we began to get, some attention. And as I mentioned earlier with the water quality case, and we've worked with other nonprofit organizations who are well respected, so some of that has been, we've worked with some respected organizations. We've tried to be open in sharing, with the city and others, how we train folks to collect, the water samples or the air samples or what have you, so that they understand that we're using, best practices. We have our quality assurance, plans and all of those things. And, it's been a bit of a time to, we just kept, pushing those results in front of them. And finally, we got the city to, then invest their own dollars and, coming behind the community to do their own investigations, and they found that, what the community, found and was, putting in front of them was very valid. We've now, been invited, to City Hall to make presentations, to, meet with department leaders in different city divisions, to look at our data and to look at what's been found. And then we're also, trying to figure out ways that we can get our data sort of input directly into new systems that the city has developed. They have new apps and things that they've developed, to help them address, problems in the city. And so we're looking for ways to try to, as our, community members are using things like the app that we developed, how can our app talk to the city's app and that sort of thing. So it's been a bit of a process, but we just keep going back to the city. I think the city has more of an incentive to work with us than maybe industry. But I will point to an example in Cancer Alley. Wilma Subra is a chemist down in Cancer Alley who works with a lot of community-based groups. And so they've started to collaborate with her and other entities to conduct, some of that scientific research. And when there are folks who have the expertise at the table, they are able to get, a little bit more traction in terms of, addressing some of those issues. But it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but we just kind of keep pushing. And I think the folks, who have been challenged by industry keep pushing as well. And, I don't have a great answer, but that's kind of what we're doing.
That's a good answer, Dr. Jelks. Recently, in New Jersey, we were attacked by Covanta with the incinerator work we're doing. And just saw, Dr. Jelks, last week someone sent to us a RFP from the American Chemical Council saying that all this stuff around cumulative impacts, you got a cumulative impact law passed in New Jersey, basically is nonsense, and they want to undermine it. And for a while, I thought my middle name was so-called, I was referred to the community so-called expert. Jim and the green sweater.
Hi there. Thank you, Dr. Jelks. My name is Brent. I'm a master's student in public policy, and before this, I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I know that the community science conversation was starting to pick up when I left a couple months ago. What are some of the recommendations, and what are some of the actions that the federal government should be taking to better support community science?
Thank you. Great question. And you may or may not be aware of this, but EPA recently published earlier this year. I'm not going to get the title right, but it's a sort of a roadmap or guidebook on best practices in what they call the participatory sciences. And so they do seem to be investing, some resources in trying to, understand what approaches are best or have worked well. They're looking at, a lot of and evaluating a lot of low-cost sensors, for things like air quality monitoring, for instance, and helping people to understand which of these, sensors might be the best products on the market to help, advance some community work. They also have had a funding RFP out earlier this year focused on community air monitoring. And so those are the types of things that I think are very important as we try to follow, how the dollars for justice allocated, through the Justice 40 initiative make their way, into communities. I think the federal government could do a lot more to support this community-based work and not just support community-based work, but to support work in which community-based organizations and grassroots groups are helping to lead this work and are getting their share of the resources to engage in the work. Because it's one thing to, have a lot of funding, initiatives in which you have to be an academic institution or a very well-endowed nonprofit organization to get those funds. And so creating more spaces so that communities can engage in this work for themselves, I think is critical. But then also, just using, all of the levers that are at the disposal of the federal government, in terms of, executive orders. And, we know that things can be challenged as we're seeing, but, I think we're on the right track with some of the ideas. So it's going to come to, some of the implementation that happens. Hopefully, we'll see some of this implementation really come to fruition in the next few years.
We'll take one last question here. And Dr. Jelks, while he's coming up, you mentioned Justice 40. Could you just explain briefly what Justice 40 is?
You would ask me. So Justice 40 is an initiative of the President Biden and his administration. And the idea is that 40%, as he, has named, climate change, and the impacts that climate change has, the impact that climate change has on communities, as a focal point of his presidency from a policy standpoint. As the federal government is investing, money in climate solutions, this whole orientation or framework of Justice 40 is basically this idea that 40% of those benefits, to these climate solutions that we are going to implement need to be felt, need to be experienced, need to go to those communities who have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. So that means low income and communities of color, the communities who have been these sacrifice zones for pollution, who have, felt the hyperlocal impacts of climate change. These are the places where we should be investing, in things like infrastructure and in, the other measures that will help make these communities more climate resilient, and as a result, make our entire country more resilient to climate, and to its impacts.
Thank you. Good explanation.
Hi, I'm Chris Rivera. I'm a postdoc and I work on conservation, science, and policy and anthropology. So my question is related to some of the questions that were asked earlier, but it has to do at least with data collection and data ownership. So you mentioned in the community approach, the communities own the data, but when, as researchers, we have to fill out IRBs, right? Our projects have to go through institutional review boards. And in order to get those projects approved, when we work with people, and a lot of it is to protect the communities that we work with, to protect those people, essentially. But at what point is that data or that formal process of protection when collecting the data and after the data is there, at what point does that end formally? So at what point does the researcher, say, okay, my project data collection process is over and IRB is closed, and the data now belongs to the people, and there may not be a formal process, right, for I don't know, managing, collecting. I mean, you have efforts where you want the people to have the data so that they can use it and own it, but what are the challenges with it, essentially? Because it's hard, right, straddling the line between the scientist, the researcher, and then stepping out of academia in that sense.
Thank you for that question. And definitely I agree with you. There are a number of challenges. I'm going through some of those, challenges right now in a project. What I can just share from my own experience is that I tend to do a lot of research in which I am engaging community members as co-researchers. So that means in some cases, they are, doing the city training themselves, they are helping to collect the data, including, interviewing other community members, or I'm working on a project now where we are, placing radon, test kits in people's homes, and also, working through a survey, with those community residents who we, when we enter their home. And so we have community researchers who are a part of that entire effort. Community researchers will be at the table when we analyze the data. Those community researchers, definitely we have to, by the IRB, talk about, where the data is going to reside. And when we talk about that community ownership, it may not, always just be the, from a protection standpoint that they have all of the, personally protected information. But, in terms of the things that, just the summary, the results, those things that they need to try to move policy, we're trying to ensure that kind of stays in the hands of community residents, that they can do what they want to do with it. We also are trying to be responsive to what the community researchers want to develop in terms of infographics and brochures or newsletters or summaries, of the research, to be able to share that and to disseminate it with the community. But, again, we're working through that process now. In fact, our project was selected for some sort of IRB review where we've got to, substantiate that we're protecting the data and, where it's sitting, where it's residing. So this is one project where, I'm kind of faced with this up close and personal. We have a few questions about what we need to do. I would say in some past projects, the data has not been such that, it was data that would be harmful to anybody. And we have, let that data, rest in the hands of the community, from our photo voice projects to, the water quality data is actually put on, public repositories as well. So we're kind of working our way, around some of this, but, we have community members who go through the IRB process. And in a few cases, I fought to not have community members have to go through the full IRB process. And the IRB allowed me to develop a training that would be a lot more accessible to community members than taking the city training. And that worked to have them, be able to engage with the data.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jelks. I see it is almost 1:25, so we're going to close out now. Let's give Dr. Jelks another hand, please.